In the early 90s, video games were arguably the best things for kids. North America and Japan may have had a better experience compared to the rest of the world. And back in Manila, only the privileged families would have owned the video game consoles, and the earliest that I could remember was playing a Atari VCS 2600, and those were being exported from the US. When Nintendo of Japan got into the market, the rest of Asia got the Famicom to all of those middle-class households that could afford the console. Then the United States would soon get their own version, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo single-handedly reviving the video game industry after the crash of 1983. While the Japanese and the American kids were blessed with their own respectable versions of video game consoles, most kids in the Philippines would just run to their neighbors, close friends, and even spend money in the game renting shops to play their favorite games. Not only Nintendo Famicom NES, but also Sega Megadrive or the Genesis, up until the release of the PlayStation in 1995. Nowadays, only a few shops exist that would rent out the latest video game consoles from Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. With the growing popularity of PC gaming and mobile phone gaming, the industry has shifted in these kinds of markets. Nevertheless, video games are still a booming industry, rivaling even music and the movie industries combined. As gamers from the 80s and the 90s, we have come a long way from the crude 4-bit graphics and sounds to the high-def, realistic, and virtual world of games that we have today. For me as a kid, I was fortunate enough that I was able to play an Atari 2600, owned a Famicom, got a chance to play with a Super Nintendo, once owned a Sega Megadrive, then got a PlayStation when I was in high school. And as a child who didn't know any better, all I cared about was playing the games that I thought that looked good. And keep in mind, this was before the internet, and magazines like Nintendo Power would not be first published by the mid-90s in North America. And at the time, all we could do is just look at the video game box arts and hope that the game would be good. Japan came up with their own gaming publication called the Famitsu. In the US, magazine catalogs from department stores like Sears and Macy's would only have sections that will feature some video game previews and mediocre reviews that barely scratch the surface of the gameplay. Now that I'm older, I have a better appreciation of the video games that I used to play by recognizing the history and the drama behind each game and the consoles. Thanks to YouTube, a lot more gaming enthusiasts are doing content about video game reviews and histories, such as G4, the Angry Video Game Nerd, and Norman the Gaming Historian. I have to establish all of that because in this video I am talking about the Netflix original series called The High Score. The first season only has 6 episodes. Each would run about 60 minutes or so, and the entire series is narrated by Charles Martinet, the voice of Mario in all of the Nintendo advertisements that we have now. Episode 1 focused more on the creation of the very first video games in Japan and America, such as Space Invaders by Nishikado Tomohiro and the first Space Invaders gaming tournament. Aside from this, the episode also showed how a group of college dropouts faced a dangerous lawsuit from Atari after making custom changes in the game Missile Command. It also showcased the father of the US video games, Nolan Bushnell, and his success with his company back then, Atari, with the coin-operated machine Pong. And the episode also tells the story of Mr. Iwatani Toru and how he came up with the game Pac-Man, up until the game was ported to the Atari VCS 2600 And of course, Atari's legacy would not be complete without being followed by Howard Scott Warshaw's game The Extraterrestrial E.T. These two games would be the headline of a lot of terrible video games that would come out during the early 80s, which ultimately led to the video game crash of 1983. Episode 2 starts with Tanaka Hirozaku and his involvement with Nintendo's arcade game Donkey Kong. The story then shifts to Nintendo of Japan trying to crack the US gaming market with the Famicom and how it was rebranded into the NES. Afterwards, the episode goes to the first ever Nintendo World Championship Tournament. To further capitalize on the growing number of gamers, Nintendo of America would soon create the phone hotline for the gamers to talk to the Nintendo gaming counselors. And, of course, the episode had to tip its hat to the man himself, Miyamoto Shigeru, the guy who created Mario, Donkey Kong, The Legend of Zelda, and many other Nintendo games. Their foothold of the US gaming market would not be so steadfast without their first legal battles, of course. Hence, the episode turns to the late John Kirby to tell the tale when Universal Studios filed a lawsuit against Nintendo for copyright infringement when they released the game Donkey Kong. The show then ends with the creation of the first US gaming magazine, Nintendo Power, to further solidify their hold onto the gamers. Episode 3 is all about role-playing games and how these games started out as text-based computer games and tabletop games, until slowly evolving to the story-driven and fully picturized games that we know now in various gaming devices. The episode also takes a special mention to Mr. Ryan Best and his created role-playing game for the LGBTQ community, arguably the first ever during the late 80s. Episode 4 has its main focus on Sega declaring war on Nintendo for video game dominance. Leading Sega's army was Tom Kalinske. He explains his multi-point strategy on giving Nintendo a good run for its money. The plan of Sega of America at the time were the introduction of Sonic the Hedgehog to battle against Mario, Sega's questionable advertisement campaign by embracing MTV culture, and holding their own video game competition with Sonic during the mid-90s. Episode 5 opens up with a disclaimer about video game violence, as it features the individuals that brought the advent of fighting games into the video game arcades and home consoles, specifically Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. Fighting games are not the only ones that were considered violent by the concerned parents at the time. Nintendo and Sega were trying to up each other with their games that each company tried to push the envelope with games that they thought were edgy. Sega releasing the game Night Trap did not really help the case of gaming violence, and along with Mortal Kombat. This eventually led to the 1993 US Senate hearing headed by former Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman and former Wisconsin Senator Herbert Cole, holding both Nintendo and Sega responsible in corrupting the youth of America. Lastly, Episode 6 blasts its way with the origin stories of the first-person shooting games and the attempts of the first 3D rendered video games. This episode features the man behind Wolfenstein, Doom, and Star Fox. Now that I was able to summarize each episode as best as I could without overly spoiling anything, I can finally say what things that I like and the things that I find less appealing. To be honest, I had a lot of fun watching this series with my wife. She is not a gamer, but she appreciated the pageantry the series presented itself in every episode. There were a few times that we paused an episode or so I could provide added context to what the show was talking about. The history of video games from the 70s up to the 90s is quite lucrative in its own right. As far as I know, there are a lot of people from Japan, America, and Europe who paved the way on how we knew video games back then and how we know video games right now. So I liked how this series tried to designate an episode with a major chapter of gaming history. One episode about the infamous Atari games, one episode about Nintendo, one episode about Sega, one episode about role-playing games, one episode about fighting games, and one episode about the first-person perspective games. I also liked how the show featured a lot of colorful individuals who etched their names in the video game history by telling their stories, showing their old notes, their old plans, recorded footages, and sharing their personal experiences when they were still in the industry. The people behind the show did not just recorded simple interviews with these awesome men and women. Even though the show is in itself a documentary history series, it was still entertaining to watch since the subject is about video games. There are a lot of segments here and there where they artistically portrayed these men and women, their comedic and dramatic experiences in a 8-bit or 16-bit fashion cartoons. All of that being said, I mentioned that the video game history is quite vast, and some of those featured individuals I am already familiar with. But there are at times that I thought that there should be more people and events that should have been included in the series that I thought were also pivotal in shaping the industry. With the subject of designating each episode, the entire narrative of the series is not really told in a chronological order. The show was edited in a way that the audience will be tossed around different decades, from the 70s to the 80s and the 90s, which can be confusing for the casual audience if they do not have any background knowledge of video games in the slightest. But I feel that they purposely did it this way, thinking that they are properly paying homage to the people in the industry who had the most influence in their respective field, regardless of the decade. And to be honest, I thought the series is going to be more in-depth with the Nintendo-Sega War, which to me would have been one of the most interesting aspects of the series, but the showrunners barely scratched the surface about it. My guess is that either they could not get hold of the other prominent figures of that conflict in time, or they just decided that there are other videos or medias already out there that painted a better picture of that conflict. The show barely even gave credit to Square's Final Fantasy and Sony's PlayStation, so hopefully they can address those things that I mentioned in the next season. So, if you are a person who loves video games that grew up in the 90s, I could not recommend this series hard enough for you to watch. To those who already have a good knowledge about gaming history, it is safe for me to say that at least you will find the stories of the interviewed people endearing, and hopefully can add a little bit more perspective on how the gaming industry works behind the scenes. And to those of you who are just casual Netflix viewers, you can give this series a shot. The visual and the audio effects of the overall editing and presentation would at least astound you to keep you glued and question yourselves on why video games are so important to a very specific subculture. It may not still be your type of time-wasting entertainment, but you can have the takeaway of a little understanding on how this industry works in the minds of the developers and in the hands of the players. So I would give this series an 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it. Loved the interviews. Loved the artistic take of their stories and all of that. What do you guys think of this series? Have you watched it? Give your comments down below. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel and turn that notification bell for more content in the near future. This is Jho-Rpg. I will see you the next time. Bye-bye.